Hey, colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And a very special thank you to Professor Nuraan Davids, who's agreed to present at this Auxin today. My name's Wade Kafon. I'm actually just filling in for Sim because he's stuck in a meeting. I also work at the Division of Learning and Teaching Enhancement. I was asked to remind you guys that there will be a feedback link posted in the comments section that you can click on after the session. So please provide us with some feedback on the session, and I hope that you do take the time to do that. Um, I think let me just go into introducing Professor Nuraan Davids and her title because I don't want to waste too much time. So the title of her presentation is Repairing Epistemic Harms Through Student Wellbeing at South African Universities. Regarding Professor Nuraan Davids' bio, Nuraan Davids is a professor of philosophy of education and the chair of the Department of Education Policy Studies in the Faculty of Education. Her research interests include democratic citizenship education, Islamic philosophy of education, and philosophy of higher education. She is a co-editor of the Routledge series World Issue in the Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education, co-president of the Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education Society, and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Education in Muslim Societies. Her most recent books include, in 2026, Teaching Ethically in the Global South, as well as a 2023 publication, Academic Citizenship, Identity, Knowledge, and Vulnerability, as well as a 2022 publication titled Out of Place, an ethnography of post-colonial citizenship. So I think without any further ado, over to you, Prof. Nuraan. And once again, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Colleagues, you can post questions in the chat as the presentation is taking place, and Prof. Nuraan will have 30 minutes in which to present. Thereafter, we'll have a 20-minute Q&A, so you can build on those questions you post in the chat, or you can clarify them, etc. So over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wade, for the introduction. Thank you, colleagues, for your time and your interest in this topic. Just to kind of sketch I think the background to this focus is that I'm also involved with the Council on Higher Education, and one of the I think more critical matters for us is the high rate of student attrition, particularly amongst Black students. At this point, we are often think that students drop out mainly because of financial reasons, or students drop out because of academic unpreparedness. But we don't really have deep insights into students who drop out because of particular experiences in higher education. More research is needed on those experiences, but we have enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that indeed we are sitting with an issue which I have couched as epistemic harms. So that's just background to the paper. Um, and so just to give you, I'm going to put my camera off so you can have a look at the screen. If you look at what I'm trying to look at in terms of how this fits into the broader discourses in higher education, I think the only time we actually begin to think about student experiences and what students are going through is when we are confronted with student protests. And if you think back to the huge protests of the roads must fall, fees must fall, I think for the first time, we really got insights into just how deeply disenfranchised and disillusioned certain students feel, that just how out of place they actually feel in higher education spaces. And I want to just clarify the parameters of this particular paper and study is that I'm looking specifically at the experiences of Black students in historically white institutions. And so it's important for me to locate that because the experiences of Black students in historically Black institutions would, of course, be entirely different. And so one of the things we confronted with is that when we look at the literature on the experiences of Black students in historically white institutions, then we often get references to Black student experiences. And the immediate concern that arises from that kind of categorization is that we have what I describe as a collectivization of experiences that almost reduces these specific experiences of historically Black students, so that all Black students' experiences are lumped into one category of experiences. And it's something which universities do almost subconsciously. I think when we look at student representation, we have certain categories, the BAIC category groups that we have, and we use these terms without any consideration for what actually happens within these categories. And we know, for example, that if we talk about Black students, there's a particular historical baggage which comes with that particular descriptor. And so there's a growing scholarship. We're seeing that come out over the last few years that looks at the intricate pathways and negotiations which historically excluded and marginalized students have to navigate, particularly when they try to enter, we're trying to enter historically white institutions. And in turn, universities are expected to cater for what they often describe as underprepared students. And so there's a kind of almost accepted narrative that happens in South Africa that when we are dealing with Black students who come from Black schools, then we can expect a certain underpreparedness. When we are dealing with white students from white schools, we can expect a preparedness. So there's a particular competency association with particular kind of schools. But we also know that once we categorize students as coming from Black institutions, then automatically there's a stigma attached to that student. And so again, universities respond to this in a very particular way. They often only look at this underpreparedness in terms of academic underpreparedness, which of course is not incorrect if you think about certain real factors and challenges that we have in historically Black schools in terms of a lack of resources, in terms of overcrowded classrooms, in terms of underqualified and unqualified teachers, and all the other accompanying economic, social challenges which often sit in historically Black schools. But the problem that we have is that to date, the overwhelming response from HEIs and particularly historically white institutions has been to look at underpreparedness only through a lens of academic unpreparedness. And so you have categories of previously disadvantaged being attached to extended degree programs, and you'll have these academic support programs being made available, and these programs are often only directed towards students who are deemed to be underprepared. So in sum, we have given substantial attention to the external barriers which make full participation in schools by Black students possible. And so we've made sure that we've tried to deal with providing academic support, but we haven't really given much attention at all to the lived experiences of Black students. We haven't attended to what it means when Black students transition ontologically from a Black school into a historically white environment, where for the first time they're going to encounter learning with students who are from different racial groups. For the first time, they might encounter teachers and tutors and lecturers who are also not Black. So it's an incredibly alien space, an alienating space. It's also often the first time for students to physically leave their home environments. And often this means transitioning from rural communities to a city-urban space like you have in Stellenbosch, for example. And so there's a huge kind of shift that happens not only academically, but socially and emotionally and psychologically. There's a huge sense of who am I in relation to this new space? How do I find myself in this space? And we know that when we listen to what the protests, and it's only ever then that we pay attention. I repeat that. When we listen to the kinds of protests and the kinds of frustrations which students express during protests, and if you look at the language and the calls for decolonization, we can see that for Black students, not for all obviously, but for some Black students, the transition into historically white spaces is profoundly unsettling, and they don't find any sort of mechanisms and support that deals with identity issues as they make that transition. They only encounter academic support, they might encounter writing support, they might encounter some sort of counseling support, but there seems to be a very loud, I think, look at what actually it means for identities to transition into a space with which they are not familiar. And the risk that we often do when we talk about experiences, whether it's about women's experiences or students' experiences or academics' experiences, that in our haste to design one or the other policy in how to deal with student experiences, we often collectivize experiences and we don't give adequate attention to those lived realities. So more and more, the literature is showing us that there are some serious harms happening. And I've picked up on the term epistemic harms, and it obviously links to the big literature on epistemic injustice that's been advanced by people like Miranda Fricker. And what epistemic harms has in mind is that the person who's being harmed, if you look at the Black student, it's not just the Black student who is stigmatized or looked at differently or assigned a different category of being Black and therefore judged accordingly in terms of being underprepared, not entirely competent, not entirely being able to measure up. It's also got to do with the knowledge the student brings. So it's both the identity of being Black as well as what the student knows. And so that the student is already deemed in a deficient way, both in terms of identity and both in terms of the knowledge. And so when we look at the Black student, automatically we look at that student in a particular framing, which says, this student is not going to be able to cope in the same way that a white student is going to be able to do. Similarly, the knowledge that the student is going to bring is not quite going to be on the same standard that a white student is going to be able to do. And research shows us that Black students pick up on that in the way they are assessed, in the way they are not always called upon when questions are being posed in lecture theatres, in the way that there's less attention being given to what they bring into a particular conversation. So when we look at defining, in defining what an epistemic harm is that it's a externally sanctioned code of knowledge that's already been predetermined onto a particular kind of body. And this is not something new to us. We know, for example, that whiteness is often associated with qualification and competence. And then by contrast, Blackness is associated with incompetence and unqualification. And so epistemic harm refers to damage that happens to an individual in terms of experiencing exclusion, marginalization, microaggressions, certain stigmas that are laid onto certain bodies before the person even engages with you. So we already have a predetermined set of ideas of how we see certain students, and in turn, what our expectations are of certain students. We might not even be aware that we do this in our class. When students seek out to speak to us, when students ask us questions via emails, how we look at postgraduate work as well, how we supervise, we may not be aware of certain prejudices and biases which have remained unchecked, but it's there. So that students who come into our spaces often feel that they don't get treated in a way that everybody else does. And in turn, because they are so marginalized and they don't believe they have voice or agency, they often lack the communication to articulate the experiences of marginalization and exclusion. And so for many Black students, when they come into historically white institutions, it means they have to negotiate and they have to assimilate. And this is not unlike the literature that we are seeing that's coming out of South African schools, where our schools have, like our universities, have been newly desegregated. And so the school has a majority group, a minority group learners come into the school. The same thing is happening into our university spaces. And I think the mistake we make with universities is that we somehow presume that because we are dealing with an older student, that they will be better equipped to navigate spaces which they find uninviting, inhospitable. But that's a huge mistake we are making. So that presumption is misplaced because it has nothing to do with age. And so we find that students, Black students who come into HWIs or historically white institutions, often have to dismantle who they are. They have to kind of negotiate certain parts of their identity, and they quickly realize that if they're going to find this sense of place in historically white institutions, that they're either going to have to assimilate entirely. In other words, they're going to have to give up entirely who they are so they can become like the dominant group. And this is something which students do almost immediately. You'll pick up with them. Some of them will go as far as changing their name. They'll say, oh, my name is X, but you can call me Y if it's easier for you. They'll change their accent. They will change the way they dress. They'll change the way they socialize. They'll play down certain aspects of their cultural, ethnic, religious identities if that is what it's going to take for them to find some sort of belonging and inclusion in historically white spaces. And so for many students, there's this really concerted awareness that I need to change who I am in order to find a sense of belonging. And that sense of belonging is not only in relation to their peers and other students, it's also in relation to the lecturers, in relation to their tutors. There's a sense of I cannot be who I actually am if I'm going to make it in this space. They recognize it's either that, or if I'm going to stay who I am and hold on to my identity, then there's a risk that I will be excluded. And for many students, unfortunately, if we look at the high attrition rates amongst Black students, being left on the periphery and not abiding by the dominant or the majoritarian stream of a particular university often means their early exit or or their premature exit. So I want to just focus a little bit here on this huge, rich literature. And if you're interested in this literature, then I would strongly advise that you engage with the ideas of George Yancey, that the literature on Blackness as the literature on whiteness is really important for us to engage with. And I want to emphasize this, that what I'm describing here is certainly not unique to South African universities. It's not, and we make this mistake in thinking that because South Africa had apartheid, that somehow racism is more embedded in our society. It's absolutely not the case. I think in many cases, and please don't interpret me wrong when I say this, but I think in many cases, apartheid has given us a language in a far stronger way than in other societies, that we are a lot more equipped to identify racism. We're a lot more equipped to identify discrimination and to call it out when we're confronted with it. But it is the case that the body is looked upon quite differently, and it's an absolute reality for particularly for Black bodies, that how they enter the public sphere, how they enter the university space, is entirely different for if you compare that to white students. If you compare how white bodies enter the Stellenbosch space, for example, it's a seamless entry. It's a sense of I already belong here. There's no hurdle which is going to make me question this, because I already see myself reflected in the ethos and culture of the institution. For Black students, however, there's a jarring moment of this is entirely alien to me. There's nothing about the space which resonates with my identity and where I have come from, particularly if you think about your typical Black school in a rural community. It's really two worlds that are completely disconnected. And so when the Black body enters the space, there's a particular gaze, and here Frans Fanon's work becomes really powerful as well, particular gaze which settles on that body. And so the body gets taken into specific different spaces, and all the time there's an awareness on that body in terms of, am I too visible in the spaces? How do I make myself invisible? How do I reduce myself so I do not get seen too easily? How do I slip beneath the radar so I don't disturb the status quo? And so there's a certain language at play which is not going to be evident to us unless we have embodied ourselves in a Black body. So in other words, the experiences that are put onto a Black body are quite unique. And the problem which often arises when we try and describe those experiences is that we somehow think it's the same for all students. And so we need to differentiate, for example, the experiences for Black women and Black men are not the same, in the same way that the experiences for women academics, Black women academics and white women academics and Indian women academics are not the same. And so there's something which happens to the body as the body enters a space, which in turn plays out in how that body finds their sense of belonging. And we know that when students do not enjoy inclusion, when they do not feel a sense of belonging in a particular school, in a particular university, in a particular postgraduate group, when there's a sense of dislocation, it's almost inevitable that that same student is going to struggle academically, even if that student had the competence in the first place. And so epistemic harm has the capacity to break down the academic capacity of students, because students lose their confidence, they lose their self-esteem when they experience discrimination. And just to give you an example, this is from my own research, my book on, I think, on academic citizenship, is that this is from a student when she says, being Black within this university community, you know that you're not accepted, and you kind of ask yourself, what's wrong with me? Like, what did I do wrong? In the beginning, I actually started to assimilate, wanting to lose myself and attain whiteness. Maybe this will work better and they'll accept me more because I'm trying to be like them. But I know that I'm lost and confused, struggling to find acceptance. I hate myself for wanting to be different, for changing the way I speak. Now, if you just read that, and even when I read that now, I remember this interview quite vividly. Even when I read this now, I see her in front of me, and I want to also reflect upon her own discomfort in even acknowledging that this is what she's doing, that she knows that she's been trying to change the way she speaks, that she's changing her accent, that she's looking for a measure of acceptance in the hope that if she becomes like everybody else, and in this case, like her white peers, that she's going to be accepted and that she will then and therefore struggle less academically. And so research shows us that students like the student here now, and I have many other similar kinds of data, is that it forces them into a liminal zone in terms of not, I've gained external access to an institution. I'm a student at this institution. I have a student card. I have a student number, and I'm registered. So I do belong to this institution, but at the same time, I don't belong because I can't participate in the same way that I would like to in the entirety of who I am. I recognize that my full participation hinges on how much of myself I'm prepared to give up. And so it's important for us to understand when we talk about this category of Black students that there's a certain impairment that's happened here. There's a certain reduction that's happened here. There's a certain negotiation that often renders Black student experiences into invisibility, that we somehow think, well, they're here. We often have the numbers that we present at Senate, for example, and we very proudly indicate the upward trajectory of the number of Black students that we are accepting in the university. So the university must be transforming because we have representation. But we haven't attended to what this means because the institution has still very much held on to particular ways of being. And I want to just say that when students experience epistemic harms, they're very reluctant to report this to university authorities. And often it's because they just don't know how. They don't feel that they have the authority. They don't feel they have the epistemic standing to actually report. They don't have the language to explain what that quotation just relayed to you. They feel that if they report experiencing marginalization and exclusion or discrimination, whether it's from peers, whether it's from the lecturer or the supervisor, there's a greater risk now of exclusion, that the experiences they're already experiencing of marginalization are simply going to intensify. And so they basically just carry on. And with the hope that they'll be able to get through the system enough so that they can graduate. And so there's a sense here that the stereotypical tropes which are put onto Black bodies are simply endured. And so unless we begin to delve into what those tropes are, unless we are prepared to interrogate our own tropes, our own blinkers that we have on, and I include we, and I say we because I include myself in that statement. We all come to this space with predetermined ideas of who we think students are and what their competencies are and who we believe can be our top achievers and who we automatically render into zones of this student is not going to make it. And do we in fact set it up that way subconsciously? Do we already kind of preemptively ensure the failure of some students or ensure that some students will not achieve in a particular way by virtue of what that body looks like? So what's the response? And I know I'm zooming through this right now because I'm so aware of time. There's this concept called well-being, which I've built into my work, and I've now expanded into what's known as epistemic well-being because I'm concerned about the knowledge which a body carries. And in philosophy, well-being is very simply described as what is ultimately good for a person. So when we talk about academic well-being, teacher well-being, student well-being, what we're actually referring to, what is going to be best for this person to thrive, what is going to be best for this person to function. And so we often see this well-being as crucial for a child to do well academically. And of course, that's not wrong at all. We know that when students are not well, when they're struggling with mental health, with mental health issues, with physical issues, when they're struggling with financial issues, when there's any sort of strain, it manifests academically. So with epistemic well-being, what I have in mind is what do students need in order to flourish at university? What do they need, not only in terms of accessing resources, but also getting to a sense of finding a sense of wellness in terms of who I am. How do we get to a space of accommodating students, of creating the conditions for students where there is no need for negotiation, there is no need for assimilation, there is no need for invisibility, that it's okay that diversity is an asset only because we embrace it with all its differences and not a desire to kind of put all students into a predetermined shape or frame. So when we look at this in terms of practical terms, what does this mean for our teaching? Now, we often talk about the fact, well, tell students to go and look at the guide, to refer students to the faculty website. And when students ask us questions, sometimes we're just so busy, we do that. And I do that as well. Go and have a look at what the faculty website has to say instead of asking me the questions. But for so many students, the rules of the academic game, the rules of the university space are simply not explicit. For most students at Stellenbosch University, they would have had parents who would have been at the university. There's a certain language already implicit in the home. They would have been exposed to certain discourses, certain kinds of codes of conduct. This is what you need to do if you want to access this program. It's already embedded in their very way of life. For most Black students who are first generation students, They don't know the rules of the game. There's no mom or dad or uncle or brother who's gone to university. So they pretty much come into this space completely blind and unknowing. So our job as teachers, as lecturers, is to demystify how knowledge works within our discipline. We have to begin to simplify, because so many times we get caught up in our own academic rhetoric. We get caught up in our own disciplinary language. I know it happens to me in philosophy all the time. How do I make sure that a child who went to a school at Kayamandi High, who's never been exposed to a proper home environment of brick and mortar, who's endured certain conditions of living, certain social realities of poverty, of economic deprivation, how do I make my language of my discipline accessible? What are the rules of the game that this child needs to know in order to succeed? We need to guide students. We need to spend a lot more time in recognizing that not all students know how to navigate institutional systems, such as SunLearn, for example, such as accessing the library. I mean, if you think about the library space, for example, we all talk about this library as a given. For most Black students, the first time they encounter a building called a library is when they come to university. Most historically Black schools, most Black schools do not have libraries. It's something which don't exist, in the same way they don't have science laboratories or language laboratories or IT laboratories. So we need to check ourselves and the presumptions we make. We need to build epistemic trust. And this means we've got to foster relationships in which students feel seen, in which students recognize that we see them as credible knowers, that we are truly giving kids and students the same opportunities. And of course, we need to know that equity comes into play here, because we treat students equally, but some students are going to need more of us than others. And that's a reality, because you cannot expect, given the very disparate backgrounds and schooling realities which students come from, that they're going to be able to operate at the same level when they get to university. And then we use our classrooms for dialogical spaces. And I mean, this idea of simply walking to a lecture theatre and simply rattling, like I'm doing now, I suppose, rattling off your PowerPoints is just not the way to teach. We've got to create spaces where students can engage with us directly. And we've got to create spaces where students can engage with each other, so that the students we teach can become more exposed to the differences which sit amongst them. The implications for learning, ultimately, what are we trying to do? We are not only in the business of cognitive acquisition. This is not a conveyor belt. It should not be a conveyor belt of knowledge production. We are busy with epistemic formation. And this means that we need to support students to become capable knowers who can act and be in this world. Because ultimately, what are we doing? We're not only equipping young people with a degree, we are basically preparing and sending young people to become citizens of South Africa, citizens of a global community. And so for this reason, we have to ensure that we develop the epistemic agency. We have to be able to tap into their curiosity. We've got to be able to create the conditions where students feel comfortable with who they are and what they know. And we need to let students know that the knowledge they bring into our spaces, it's valuable. Because so often students feel that who I am and the knowledge I bring and the traditions which I hold on to, with this indigenous knowledge, it's not really reflected in the ethos of the community. And I know we try in Stellenbosch University to create a, a culture of multiculturalism and a culture of multilingualism. But what else are we doing to make sure that we're creating inclusive environments? We need to integrate subjective and objective well-being. And that means that it's not simply enough to think about providing resources. It's also about making sure that we are dealing with the subjectivity of what it means to be a Black student. But we are checking in on our students, that we're creating an open door where students feel comfortable enough to want to learn from us. So many times when I speak to students and I'll say, go and ask a lecturer when they come to me with a problem, because I happen to be the chair of the department, and I'm often astounded when students say to me, I'm afraid to ask that person a question. What is that fear about? And these are things which we know we do, and we need to question those things. And then finally, in terms of assessment, of course, we talk about teaching and learning. We have to embed our assessment into that. And so it's got to do with reconceptualizing assessment, not only as a means of evaluating, but developing epistemic capability. And it's not just about mastery of subject. It's not only measuring, but it's also got to do with what kinds of students we are producing. So yeah, our assessments also, and regardless of the subject, the subject matter or discipline we are busy with, is we've got to be authentic. We've got to reconsider our assessment task. We need to align it with the world in which the student is being prepared for. And of course, that will relate to the profession that student often enters. We've got to be transparent and fair in the way assessed. So many times we might make a rubric available to students, but students don't really know how we're assessing. What are we looking for? What are the criteria? What's going to make me get an A for this as opposed to just getting through? And as academics, we have predetermined ideas of how we assign excellence. And so we've got to be a lot more aware of our own role in how we perpetuate epistemic harm. And so we've also got to make sure we use formative assessment practices. It's not a catching out exercise. I want to test how much you know. I want to test how much you've memorized. But it's got to do with how do we improve the ways of knowing? How do we cultivate critical thinking? How do we improve the ways of engaging with knowledge? And so in conclusion, it's also got to do with assessing our own assessment practices and the way we set up these practices and what it is we are actually hoping to achieve through the assessment practices that we do use. Are we interested only in memorization and content knowledge, or are we actually interested in developing and cultivating a thinker? I'm going to stop there. Okay, thank you. Sure, I feel exhausted. I know I've raced, and I apologize for racing.
Well, no, Prof Nuraan, thank you very much for that. I know time is of the essence, so you were trying to get as much out as possible.
Sure, yeah.
Colleagues, some comments that did come through in the comment section. I think
Okay.
basically what is being said there is that a reiteration of the points that you highlighted, that certainly we find ourselves in positions where we are privileging certain students, and this reproduces epistemic harm and ignorance. So we're ultimately producing graduates and leaders that are in some way perhaps disconnected from South African realities while perpetuating our exclusionary institutional cultures. So I don't know, the colleagues who commented, I don't know if you'd like to perhaps build on that or pose a question, or if there's anybody else who has something that they
I
would like
see a
to say.
hand. Prof. Arno's hand is up. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Prof. Arno, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was really interesting and also difficult to listen to, I think, because just from the point of view, I'm in science, so there's also this huge challenge, just to kind of engaging on the language, which is often very social science, right? So it was challenging for me. So I have a number of sort of like questions and wanting to sort of understand. One of the things is, I know right at the beginning, you made this really important distinction of saying, we talk about just a black student, but we can't just talk about a black student, because is it a black male student? Is it a black female student? And what is their context and where they come from? And of course, at Stellenbosch, we have this thing where it's not just the black students, black, Indian, and colored is all together. It's just suddenly that's, the non-white is lumped together like that. So there's this huge impact. However, through your talk, it felt like you also ended up falling into this kind of language, which is this natural, where it felt like you were always talking about, it was the black student, the black student, the black student in terms of the problems. My question is, do we have data that sort of tries to extract where problems are coming up in terms of students who are really struggling to fit into university? So you were talking about a black student who has come from a black school in a rural black school somewhere. Whereas, I mean, there must be many black students who are at the university who've come through sort of very mixed schools in the cities, where there's a mix of white and black. And do we have like an understanding? Are the feelings between those? And I mean, and even now, I'm kind of just or trying to suddenly make it into two separate categories when it actually might be 5 categories, and that sort of thing. But do we, even if we had to break it into those 2 categories, do we see the same sort of experiences of someone who's coming from the rural Black school versus the city mixed school? And are the same sort of problems arising, or is it completely different? I don't know.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Prof. Arno. No, the experiences are entirely different because your Black learners who have come from historically white institution would have been exposed to resources, right? They would have been exposed to rugby fields, soccer fields, and so forth, and libraries and labs, and definitely lower learner to teacher ratios, and a lot more support structures in terms of on-site psychological support, counseling, sometimes even occupational therapy and so forth. Whereas if you compare that to your other extreme of your typical Black school, none of those that I've just listed would have been the case. So simply in terms of resources, the exposure would have been different. Similarly, your Black learners, and I'm not kind of lumping them all together here, but what we do know is that despite coming from desegregated spaces at historically white schools, often they would report on a lack of integration. And so we see a huge chunk of kids only interacting with their own kind, even if they are at diverse schools. But they would have encountered differences in terms of race from peers as well as the teachers. That, of course, again, would not be the case for your Black kids. So for your Black children who come from your historically Black schools, none of that would have happened. And so from the outset, Stellenbosch presents a very different South Africa. And it presents a very different context. And so I also just want to add, I wouldn't want to categorize these in any way. I don't think we can talk about 1 or 2 categories. I don't think we can talk about 5 categories. I think we need to talk about a Black student experience. And I think it's important for us to begin to get to the fact that there are multiple experiences residing in Stellenbosch, and that we need to begin to get to understand some of those experiences to have a better sense of, do these students experience some sort of epistemic harm? And if that is the case, then what can I do as an individual in my capacity to mitigate against that? I hope I've answered you.
Yeah, thank you.
That stuff.
Okay, colleagues, we are almost out of time, so I don't know if we can take perhaps just one more question or comment before we conclude. Are there any hands, or maybe just unmute yourself? It looks like Dr. Jennifer Feldman. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Nuraan. Thoroughly enjoyed that presentation. I think the thing that struck me, and something which I'd love to explore, you talk about students coming from schooling into higher education, but as you know, I teach on a postgraduate, actually only in postgraduate spaces in currently, and I feel the same thing exists because we have the students coming from different higher education institutions, and another level of expectations is then in place. They have a higher education qualification, they've done an undergrad, they've been exposed to postgraduates or to post-schooling studies, and so therefore they will fit in. And when they don't, I feel like it's, again, the onus is put on the student for not showing up. You have the qualification, and so you're expected to be able to do something. And I think that that would be a layer that I'd love to explore, because that really does concern me. Because it's almost more expected at that level that they should fit in, and that it should now be sort of more seamlessly integrated. And I know that it's certainly not that.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jennifer. That's a really valuable point in terms of we somehow think that we've submitted to the postgrad students that you've been through the Stellenbosch way, right? You've been here for 4 years, 3 years, 5 years, and so you should be au fait with the culture. But I'm always amazed by how many students are not. And I'm always amazed by how some students continue, even if they've been here up to master's level, they skirt only on the periphery. They kind of occupy those liminal spaces. They never quite move to the center. And the question is, how do we restructure that center so that center becomes more inclusive? What do we need to do so that that center widens and that the periphery reduces? And I think that's the challenge that we have as academics, I think. But also, I want to say that institutionally, there's a lot more that can be done that can deal with that at a social, cultural level in terms of creating those spaces. And for me, it's got to do with a key question of when we say we diversify the university space, do we only look at diversifying our spaces in terms of inviting more students in? Is that how we understand it? Or do we recognize that when we invite somebody in, we have to create the spaces for all of those different identities to find hospitality? You know, it's a bit like you invite somebody over to your home and the person says, well, I'm actually vegetarian. Are you going to prepare a vegetarian meal, or are you going to insist the person eats something else? So it's about how hospitable are we as an institution to the diversity which we invite in.
Yeah. So, and then also what I was also referring to was students that come from other universities, because that's what happens, you know, certainly in the postgraduate PGCE program. I mean, about 40% of our students on that program actually, because I asked them, have come from other university spaces. And that's, for them, I know, a massive challenge. And then if we talk about historically white institutions versus historically Black institutions, those that come from historically Black institutions, they often struggle to fit in here. And I think that's a piece that we, I don't think we pay nearly enough attention to.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. Very valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, colleagues. You know, it seems like this conversation is very much Stellenbosch specific in terms of what is being said over here, because throughout of South Africa, many institutions have been pushing for a long time, you know, to jump on these so-called buzzwords of decoloniality, etc. And what it always comes down to is one must ask, what is our understanding as a collective of that? Because certainly, as you guys have correctly said, it's not in mere representation to make people feel more welcomed or to be hospitable. But what needs to change more is maybe the mindset, the thinking, and the hearts of the individuals who hold this power to, you know, welcome some in and make others feel less welcome. So I think I just wanted to, you know, maybe conclude with a comment like that. Prof Nuraan, thank you very, very much. I don't know if you want to give us a concluding comment, so just to like end with a punch. No?
Yeah. If I may, I just saw that I just picked up on, I haven't read all the comments. I've just seen that somebody says that this is specific to Stellenbosch University. Yeah, it's I can, this is my space. It's my university, right? So I'm speaking, and it's important that we interrogate our spaces. However, I also want to say that the problems we experience at Stellenbosch is not unique to Stellenbosch University. The other universities have similar challenges. We need to recognize that it's okay for us to be uncomfortable in our own spaces sometimes, because that's where the learning happens. We don't have to always feel that we belong. It's okay for us to interrogate these spaces. It's okay for us to question ourselves. That's where the learning happens. The one thing about, final sentence, the one thing about the university, which is both a threat and an asset. It's a threat because it's unpredictable. And that is that we have the unpredictability of who's coming in. We never know who's going to be in our class next year, who is supervising. It changes all the time. So there's an unpredictability and an unknowingness, right? Which can be a bit jarring. At the same time, it's an opportunity, because that's where the learning happens. It also means we have to be fluid. We have to be able to question our practices, so that fundamentally we have to ask ourselves the question, does every student in my class feel that they belong in this class? And what have I done to either support that and advance that or not?
Thank you very much. That was a very long final sentence.
Comments.
Colleagues, please don't forget to fill in the feedback form that you'll find on the top of our comment section. Also, I just need to Remind you guys that the next Auxin will be on the 18th of May. That'll be held at Stias, so you can attend that one in person. But if not, we'll also have it online. That's the TLA day, and there we'll have the Koopmans talking about AI and credible learning in higher education. So certainly something to look forward to. Should be quite interesting and quite a good one. But thanks again, Prof, for joining us and for giving us a wonderful presentation. And colleagues, thank you for joining us. Please do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Wade. Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.